Rain hadn't touched the Sabine bottomlands in 40 days, and the cypress along the slough had gone the color of old rope. The water that was left sat low and brown and still, and the air above it shimmered like something trying to lie to you how bad things were. In East Texas in the summer of 1879, the heat didn't roar, it settled. It pressed down on the pine flats and the cotton rows and the little crooked town of Merrow Bend, until even the dogs gave up barking and lay in whatever shade they could steal. Heat like that has a way of stripping a place down to its truth. It burns off the small kindnesses people show each other when times are easy, and what's left underneath is the real measure of a town and of the people who stayed in it. Tabitha Wren had stayed. She was 31 years old that summer, and she ran the dry goods and feed store at the corner where the Nagdachas Road bent south, the same store her husband had built with borrowed lumber and a stubbornness that finally killed him. Wallace Wren had been a good man in the way that good men sometimes are, kind, hopeful, and entirely unsuited to the work of staying alive on the frontier. A horse went down in a creek crossing 2 springs back and rolled on him, and that was the whole of it. No fever, no long goodbye, no chance to set his affairs in order. One morning he rode out with a wagon of nails and barbed wire, and by evening 4 men carried him home on a door, and Tabitha learned in the space of an afternoon what every frontier widow learns sooner or later, which is that the world does not pause to ask whether you are ready. She had buried him behind the Methodist church, and then she had opened the store the next morning because the alternative was to sit in the empty rooms above it and listen to the silence he'd left behind. There was a debt to the lumber company in Jefferson. There was the mortgage that the bank in Merrow Bend held, a building owned by a thin, soft-spoken man named Prentice Hale who smiled at you the way a card-sharp smiles at a man with money he doesn't know how to keep. And there was Tabitha herself, alone in a town that had decided, with the easy cruelty of small places, that a woman running a store by herself was a temporary situation, a problem that would correct itself when she ran out of money or married whoever came asking. 2 men had come asking. She had turned them both down. The town noted it, the way towns note everything, and filed her under prideful and waited. She was sweeping the dust off the front boards just past dawn when she saw the boy. He came up the Nacogdoches Road on foot, which was strange in itself because nobody walked into Merrow Bend in July if they had any other choice. He was small, maybe 9 or 10, with a sunburn across his nose and a flour sack shirt and trousers cut down from a man's pair and rolled at the cuff. He carried a tin pail in one hand and nothing else in the world that she could see. He stopped at the bottom of her steps and looked up at her with the flat, careful eyes of a child who has learned that asking for things usually goes badly. "You the lady that knew Wallace Wren?" he said. Her broom went still. Nobody had said her husband's name to her in months. The town had a way of stepping around it, as if grief were a hole in the floor a person might fall into. "I was married to him," she said. "Who's asking?" "My pa was." "Is." The boy frowned, correcting himself, and the correction cost him something. "He used to be. He knew Mr. Wren from before. From the war and after. He sent me to find you." Tabitha set the broom against the doorframe and came down 1 step, slow, the way you'd move toward a deer you didn't want to startle. "Where's your pa now?" "Down the road a piece. He can't walk so good no more." The boy's chin came up a fraction, defending something. "He's not drunk. People always think he's drunk. He's got the shakes from the fever, the one that took my ma. It comes and goes. Right now it's bad. He couldn't make the walk, so he sent me." She should have asked more questions. Later, she'd think about that, about all the sensible things a careful widow with a mortgage and no margin for charity ought to have asked. Instead, she asked the only one that mattered. "What's your name?" "Ellie Hartwell, my pa's Thomas." The name landed in her somewhere she'd thought was closed for good. Thomas Hartwell. Wallace had spoken of him exactly once on a winter night when the store ledger wouldn't balance and he'd gotten quiet in the way that meant he was somewhere else. "I owe my life to a man named Hartwell," he'd said. "Antietam. I'd be in the ground 20 years if not for him." And then he'd never spoken of it again, the way men who came back from that war so often wouldn't, and she had let it lie. And now here was the man's son standing in the dust at the bottom of her steps holding an empty pail. Before we go on, it's worth pausing on the size of what a child carries when a grown man can no longer carry it himself. There is no childhood in a boy who walks a sick father's debts into a stranger's town. He had spent his. She gave Eli a biscuit and a cup of buttermilk while she pulled on her boots, and then she hitched the mule to the buckboard and let the boy show her the way. Thomas Hartwell was sitting under a blackjack oak a mile down the road with his back against the trunk and his hat over his eyes, and at first she truly did think he was dead. He was a big man gone gaunt, all knuckles and hollows, with 2 days of dust on a face that might have been handsome once before whatever had happened to it happened. When she crouched beside him, his hand came up, not fast, but sure, closing around her wrist, and his eyes opened, and they were clear. That was the thing she remembered after. Whatever the fever did to his body, it had left his eyes alone, and they took her measure in one cool sweep. "You're his wife," Thomas said. His voice was rough as a rasp. "I'm sorry to hear he's passed. The boy told me on the road. I'm sorry I brought you out for nothing. We'll move on." "You can't even stand," Tabitha said. "I've been not standing for a while now. Got pretty good at it." Something that wasn't quite a smile moved across his face. "I didn't send the boy to beg. I want that understood. I sent him because Wallace told me once, a long time ago, that if I was ever truly out of road I should come find him, that he'd settle the account. I came to settle it the other way, to tell him the debt was paid in full and he owed me nothing. That was all. I didn't know he was gone." "What debt?" The not-quite smile again. "The kind you can't pay in money. I pulled him out of a creek bed at Antietam with a hole in his shoulder and the whole Confederate army between us and our line. He was sure he'd die owing me. I came 200 miles to tell him he never owed me a thing. He let go of her wrist. Reckon I told you instead. Same as good. Come on, Eli." But Eli didn't move, and Tabitha looked at the boy, and the boy looked at the ground, and she understood several things at once. She understood that there was no place down the road for them to go. She understood that a man who would walk himself half to death to release another man from a debt he didn't even know he carried was a particular kind of man, and not a common one. And she understood, standing in the heat with the cicadas screaming in the dry grass, that her own house above the store had been silent for 2 springs, and that she was tired of silence. "There's a back room behind the store," she said. "It's got a cot and a stove. You'll work it off when you're able. The boy can help me at the counter." She straightened and dusted her skirt and didn't look at either of them while she said it because she didn't trust her face. "I won't have it said I took charity in or gave it out. This is a hire. You're hired." "You don't know me," Thomas said. "Wallace did. That's enough for a month. After that we'll see." It took both of them and the boy to get him into the buckboard. The first weeks were hard and quiet. Thomas Hartwell was not a man who knew how to be helped, and his body betrayed him daily in ways that humiliated him. The fever came in waves. Some mornings his hands shook so badly he couldn't hold a cup, and on those mornings he stayed in the back room and wouldn't let the boy see him, and Tabitha learned to leave a plate by the door and walk away. But the fever came and went as Eli had promised, and on the good days the man worked. He couldn't lift a feed sack yet, but he could mend. He had a way with broken things, harness, hinges, the busted cane chairs people brought in hoping for a miracle. He'd sit on the porch with a knife and a length of hickory and rebuild a chair seat so it was stronger than the day it was made, and word got around, the way it does, and folks who hadn't set foot in the Wren store since Wallace died started coming by with things that needed fixing and buying flour while they waited. Tabitha noticed the ledger first. It had been bleeding red for 2 years, and somewhere in the 2nd month it stopped. She didn't tell him that. She wasn't sure why. Eli was the easy part. The boy took to the store the way a plant takes to water, learning the bins and the weights and the prices, scrambling up the ladder for the high goods, charming the church women into buying ribbon they didn't need. He laughed easily once he decided he was safe, a high, clear sound that filled up rooms, and Tabitha found that she'd started leaving the door between the store and the kitchen open just to hear it. She had not let herself want children after. It had seemed like a door it was safer to keep shut, but the boy didn't ask permission to walk through it. He just did the way children do, And one evening she caught herself braiding cord into a slingshot for him at the kitchen table and had to stop and put her hands flat on the wood and breathe for a minute because the wanting had come back and the wanting had teeth. The town watched all of it. Of course it did. Now it would be easy to make Marrow Bend the villain of this, and easy is usually a lie. Most of the town was only doing what frightened, struggling people do, which is mind the boundaries of their own small safety. But there is always one who is something worse, and in Marrow Bend that summer it was Prentice Hale. Hale held the paper on the store. He had held it patiently for 2 years, the way a man holds a hand of cards he knows is winning, waiting for the widow to falter so he could fold her building into the 3 others he already owned on the square and become, in fact and not just ambition, the man who owned Marrow Bend. A failing widow was no threat to that plan. A widow whose store was suddenly turning a profit, with a tinker mending half the county's furniture on her porch and a boy charming the till full. That was a different thing. He came by on a Saturday in his good coat, smelling of bay rum, and he looked at Thomas Hartwell on the porch with his knife and his hickory, the way a man looks at a stain on something he intends to own. "Didn't know you'd taken on help, Mrs. Wren," he said. "Folks are talking. A man and a woman, no kin between them, living under the one roof." He let it sit. "I'd hate for your reputation to be the thing that finally sinks this enterprise, after you've worked so hard to keep it afloat." Tabitha stood in the doorway with a sack of cornmeal on her hip and felt the old familiar cold come into her chest, the cold of a person being measured and found inconvenient. "He sleeps in the back room and the boy on the cot beside him," she said. "And it's my roof, Mr. Hale, bought with my husband's labor, and what happens under it is my concern and the Lord's, not yours." "It becomes the bank's concern when the loan comes due in the fall." He smiled. "I do hope you'll be current." He tipped his hat and walked off across the square, and Thomas Hartwell never looked up from his whittling, but that evening, low, so the boy wouldn't hear, he said, "How much is the note?" "That's not your trouble." "How much?" She told him. It was more than the store would clear before the fall, even now. He nodded slowly, like a man filing a thing away, and said nothing else, and she thought that was the end of it. Here is the thing about a debt paid the way Thomas Hartwell paid debts. He did not announce it. He did not ask permission. He simply began the next morning to do something about it. What she didn't know, what she pieced together later from the boy and from a freighter who came through in August, was that before the war and before the fever and before the road wore him down to knuckles and hollows, Thomas Hartwell had been a gunsmith of some reputation in Shreveport, and that his hands, which shook so badly some mornings he couldn't hold a cup, on the good days could still do work that no one else for 100 miles could do. He sent Eli with a note to the sheriff, and the sheriff sent word to the marshal's office in Jefferson, and quietly, without it ever crossing Tabitha's counter, a trade began. Worn service revolvers and broken rifles came down the road in a feed sack, and clean ones went back, and money she never saw began to gather in a tin behind a loose brick in the back room against the fall. She found out by accident the way you find out the important things. She went looking for the boy one evening and found the 2 of them in the back room by lamplight, and hands moving over the disassembled parts of a Colt with a tenderness that stopped her in the doorway. The shaking was on him. She could see it, and he was working through it, slow, patient, his jaw set, teaching the boy the name of each piece as he went. "This is the cylinder, this is the bolt, you don't force it. You feel where it wants to go." And the boy was leaning in with his whole heart, learning a trade, learning a father, and Thomas's eyes flicked up and caught hers in the doorway, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all. "You should have told me," she said finally. "You'd have said no." "I'd have said it's too much. I'd have said I won't have a man crippling himself to pay a debt that isn't his." "It was always mine," Thomas said quietly. "Wallace pulled me back too that day. Not from a creek, from after. I came home from that war wanting to put a gun in my own mouth, and your husband wrote me letters for 3 years till I didn't anymore. That's the debt, Mrs. Wren. I never got to tell him I'd come good on it. So I'm telling his house instead." The lamp guttered. The boy had gone very still between them, the way children do when the air in a room changes. My name is Tabitha, she said. I'd take it kindly if you'd use it. It is a small thing, a name, and it is the whole world. There is a particular loneliness in being called Mrs. by your own life for 2 years, addressed only as the remainder of a man who is gone. When she gave him her name, she was unlocking a door, and they both knew it, and the knowing sat in the lamplit room like a third presence, warm and frightening. The fall came on, and with it Prentice Hale's reckoning. He had not been idle. A man like that never is. He had gone to the church women with concern in his voice, and to the men with figures, and by September there was a coolness in town that hadn't been there in August, a sense of a verdict being assembled. And he had done one thing more, the thing that nearly broke it all. He had found out about the gun trade, and he had gone to the county and suggested, with the soft regret of a man who only wants order, that Thomas Hartwell was a stranger of no fixed character running an unlicensed traffic in firearms out of a widow's back room, and that a respectable town might want to ask some questions before it got worse. The sheriff came on a gray Tuesday with the first cold rain of the year on his hat. He was not a bad man, he was a tired one. He stood in the store dripping and would not meet Tabitha's eye and said there'd been a complaint, and that the marshal wanted Hartwell to come to Jefferson and answer some questions, and that it would go easier if he came quiet. And that was the moment the whole thing turned, because Thomas Hartwell stood up from the porch chair and reached for his hat, ready to go, ready to walk back out of their lives the way he'd walked into them, to carry his trouble down the road so it wouldn't land on the house. She saw it in his face. He was going to disappear the way he'd been disappearing his whole life, because he had decided somewhere long ago that he was a thing that brought ruin and the only kindness he had to offer was distance. No, Tabitha said. The word came out flat and certain and stopped the room. There's no complaint to answer, she said, because there's no unlicensed traffic. Every repair done in this store is done under the license of this store, which I hold in my name since the spring my husband died. She walked to the counter and pulled the ledger out and set it down hard enough to raise dust. It's all in here. Every gun, every dollar, taxed and recorded. He works for me. He's my hired man and my partner, and if Prentice Hale wants to know what a man and a woman are doing under one roof, he can come ask me to my face and I'll tell him. The sheriff looked at her and at Thomas and at the boy in the doorway, and something in him that was still a man and not just a tired official seemed to settle. What would you tell him, Mrs. Wren, he asked, and it wasn't unkind. She had not planned to say it. She'd think about that after, how the truest things come up out of you with no rehearsal at all. She looked at Thomas Hartwell standing there with his hat in his shaking hands, halfway out the door of One More Life, and she said, I'd tell him I aim to marry the man, so he'd best mind how he talks about my intended. The store went silent. The rain ticked on the windows. Thomas's hand, the one with the hat, went very still. The shaking just stopped, the way it sometimes did when the whole of him gathered toward one thing, and he turned and looked at her, and she made herself hold his eyes and not look away, because she had said it now and it was true, and a person ought to be able to look at the truth. You didn't ask me, he said. His voice had gone strange. No, I didn't. She lifted her chin. Wallace didn't ask me either the first time. Said it straight out in front of the preacher's wife and dared me to say no. I figure it runs in the kind of men I take to. A breath. Ask me now if you want to, or don't. But you're not walking down that road, Thomas Hartwell. Not today. Not from this house. The sheriff, to his lasting credit, found something to study very hard out the window. Thomas crossed the room. He didn't go down on a knee. Neither of them was built for that, and the floor was wet besides. He stood close and looked down at her, and the boy crept in from the doorway and stood against her skirt, and Thomas said, Lo, I'm a sick man, Tabitha. Some mornings I can't hold a cup. The fever might take me in a year, or it might take me in 20, and you'd be burying another husband, and I don't know that I've got the right to ask that of you twice in one life. I've thought about all of it, she said. I've thought about it more than you know, and I'd rather have a year of a man who walks 200 miles to pay a dead friend's debt than 40 years of a man who'd let me drown to keep his own feet dry. She put her hand against his chest over the rough cloth, over the heart she could feel going hard underneath. Ask me, he asked her. She said yes before he finished. The town, in the end, did what towns do, which is rearrange itself around a fact it cannot change. They were married in the Methodist church in October, with the cold rain finally breaking the long drought outside, and the churchwomen who had whispered in September baked for the supper after, because a wedding is a wedding, and people would rather be on the side of a thing than against it. Prentice Hale was not there. The note came due in November, and Tabitha walked into the bank and laid the full amount on the counter in coins and worn bills in the marshal's drafts, and watched Hale count it twice and watched him understand that he had lost, and tipped her head to him the way you do to a man you have beaten fairly, and walked out into her own free life. The store did well. The skloo filled back up that winter, and the cypress greened, and Marrow Ben forgot the way places do, that it had ever doubted her. Thomas's hands never fully stilled, but the boy's hands learned everything his fathers knew, and on the bad mornings Eli would sit at the workbench and do the fine work while his father named the pieces, and the two of them together did what neither could do alone. That spring Tabitha stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the store and watched them bent over the bench in the early light, the man and the boy who had walked out of the dust to settle a debt and stayed to become her family, and she pressed her hand flat to her belly where the third of them was just beginning, and she did not say anything, because some happiness is too large to fit through the mouth. Out on the Nacogdoches road, the dust she'd first seen the boy come walking through had turned, with the rain, to good black mud, the kind that holds a wheel and grows a crop and keeps a thing exactly where it has chosen at last to stay. The bravest thing a person ever does is not facing down the Prentice Hales of this world, nor walking 200 miles on failing legs to keep a promise made in a creek bed 20 years gone. The bravest thing is far quieter than that. It is opening a door you have nailed shut for the best reasons you had and standing in the draft of it and saying to whatever is waiting on the other side, "Come in, there is room. There was always room. I only forgot." What stays with me about Tabitha Wren is not the wedding or the rain that finally broke the drought. It's the morning she stood at the bottom of her own steps and asked a strange boy his name instead of asking him what he wanted. That small choice was the hinge the whole rest of her life turned on, and I think about it more than I should. Nothing in that story happened by accident. Thomas Hartwell walked 200 miles on failing legs because Wallace once wrote him letters until he set down a gun he meant to use on himself, and a man who has been carried like that learns that a debt is a kind of promise you keep with your whole body. Tabitha's store stopped bleeding red, not because she got lucky, but because she opened a door she had every reason to keep nailed shut and let a sick man and his boy walk through it. Prentice Hale lost not because he was stupid, but because he believed a frightened widow would stay frightened, and he never once accounted for what a person becomes when she stops protecting her loneliness and starts protecting her people. I've come to believe that a life is built out of exactly three things, and that story shows all three. The first is the plain refusal to do the easy, cowardly thing. Tabitha could have sent the boy away with a biscuit and a clear conscience, and instead she did the harder, decent thing and took them in. That kind of decency isn't softness. It costs something every single time. The second is the sense to see what's actually in front of you. She watched Thomas's hands rebuild broken chairs stronger than new and understood she wasn't looking at charity. She was looking at a man worth standing beside, and she read Prentice Hale just as clearly, which is why she beat him. Seeing people as they really are, not as fear paints them, is its own kind of quiet brilliance. And the third is the thing I respect most because it's the rarest. When the sheriff came in the cold rain and Thomas reached for his hat, ready to vanish down the road the way broken men do, it would have been so easy for Tabitha to let him go and call it kindness she didn't. She planted her feet in her own store and said no, and she said it loud, and she didn't look away from the truth once she'd spoken it. That's the muscle you only build by using it. The stubborn refusal to drown quietly when standing up is still an option. Decency, clear eyes, and a backbone. Tabitha had walked 2 springs in the dark, believing the safest thing was to want nothing. The boy on the road taught her she was wrong, and the wanting she'd been so afraid of turned out to be the very thing that saved them all. We spend so much of our lives nailing doors shut for the best reasons we have. The bravest people I know are the ones who finally pry one open and say, "Come in?" There was always room.